Thank you for joining me today for another episode of the Healthy AF podcast. With me today is James Arthur, founder of Seatopia, which is a sustainable, regenerative aquaculture, right? A supply of healthy fish. Let's see, but we'll get into it and explain what that means. James Arthur, thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you, Zane. It's a conversation that not a lot of people get too excited about until they realize the importance of our relationship to seafood on the blue planet and what a vast difference sourcing can make, as far as like access to bioavailable clean seafood. So yeah. Aquaculture, as you said, is the farming of seafood. Aquaculture encompasses anything from, growing marine animals for pharmaceuticals or for regenerative ecosystem reparation or for food consumption. So yeah, aquaculture in the most practical aspect of what we're doing is growing from seed to harvest size, controlling the feed to optimize for how do you produce superfood, the cleanest seafood. But it gets confusing because not all farms in the ocean are created equal, just like not all farmed cattle. So yeah, there's a wide variety of ways in which seafood can be farmed, from commodity stuff that sold to people who don't ask questions to like really specialty stuff for specific audiences looking for the cleanest, most nutrient dense seafood available.
Very good, because you're essentially farming fish, correct?
Absolutely. The livestock husbandry, like learning how to get fish to spawn and to breed, and learning how to collect fertilized eggs and bring them through the processes of like, smoltification to fingerlings to grow out different diets necessary throughout the whole phase. Yeah. Aquaculture encompasses raising fish from eggs. And there are some extensions of that, but some people call ranching aquaculture. But yeah, farming fish in general. But not just fish, farming seaweeds and crustaceans and anything farming in aquatic environment would be considered aquaculture.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, is your set? I mean, most people's concept of farm raised fish is often negative, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, some people, like you said, there's some people who just don't ask questions, but for people who are sort of health conscious, you think of some sort of trough or some sort of man made water
Pond.
space that is
Yeah.
pond of some sort and they're being fed corn
Yep.
and so forth. And you're obviously doing things very different from that. So could you kind of tell us a little bit about how your operation set up? Are you offshore? Are you set up offshore? Are you in like a freshwater situation? How do you set up your ranch, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the question is like the differentiation between the practices that we consider sustainable or regenerative compared to like factory farms. A lot of people have these negative impressions of factory farmed fish because that absolutely exists. I would say that is the majority of what gets developed, because the majority of foods these days through the industrial food system is crap, factory commodity stuff. But just like you have the difference between factory farmed chickens and pasture raised chickens that are outdoor, part of a crop rotation scheme that is like literally regenerating the environment, fish can be raised in a huge variety of environments. So I'll give you a couple examples. I'll name a few things. So extensive aquaculture is regenerative practice where seafood is raised without feeding it at all. So one example is a farm that we work with in Andalusia, Spain, and they've taken a formerly degraded estuary that was turned into basically a salt mine, and they reflooded it, reintroduced the plants and zooplankton, and created an environment where phytoplankton, zooplankton thrive, and then plankton shrimp and various forms of shrimps really started to thrive. And then a native species of branzino, Mediterranean sea bass and sea bream came into these estuaries, as they generally would do. The juveniles would come into there seeking refuge, and they thrive because they're eating all of the shrimp and the phytoplankton that are being fed the zooplankton and the microalgae. And you create this environment where the fish are thriving. And that is extensive aquaculture, where you're essentially creating an environment where the fish are naturally feeding on a rich diet, safe from most predators, and it can be subsidized through putting fish from a hatchery into that environment so that you get specific species from specific genetics that you want to raise that have unique characteristics like their market value. It can also be subsidized with feed, but that is in general extensive farming is an environment as close to natural as possible where you're actually not even feeding them. They're eating zooplankton, phytoplankton, low trophic organisms. We also do this in Indonesia in mangroves in an area where mangroves were previously deforested. Local communities are paid to replant the mangroves, and then they flood these mangroves with tidal canals and release a native species of shrimp, black tiger shrimp, into these environments. And these black tiger shrimp are foraging again on zooplankton and phytoplankton. They're not being fed anything. They're literally just out there foraging. And then every 12 months, they harvest the black tiger shrimp and sell them as a premium product that is regenerative black tiger shrimp raised on this super clean microalgae diet. And the unique thing about these sort of diets is that they're getting the super high concentration of DHA and EPA in a natural state. You can also take a step further and start intensively farming, but using similar feeds. And that would generally just be called like an open net pen using an innovative feed. So we have an example of that in southern Chile, where we're working with a steelhead trout farm that has replaced a traditional commoditized diet of corn and soy with microalgae and insect protein from soldier flies. And so they're getting a species appropriate diet. Like steelhead trout naturally eat insects. They're insectivores. They're, going up into the rivers, eating whatever insects are around, and then supplementing the fats in the diet through industrial farmed microalgae that is super rich in DHA. These fish end up having higher levels of DHA omega-3s than natural counterparts or wild counterparts, but they're also cleaner because they're not getting exposed to things that they might get exposed to in the wild, like heavy metals, mercury, microplastics. So that's another farm. And then integrated multi-trophic aquaculture would be another example of farming that is a corollary in land-based farms would be something like permaculture, where you develop a system where you have low trophic organisms like shellfish and kelp surrounding higher trophic species like salmon, and then they work symbiotically because salmon poop is actually rich in nitrogen, phosphorus, that is fertilizer for the kelp and the shellfish. So they work symbiotically together. There's a lot of places around the world where you actually can't farm shellfish because it's oleotrophic, meaning there's not enough nutrients in the water. So you introduce something like salmon poop, and all of a sudden you have a kickstarted fertilizer for this micro environment that you're creating. This is called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. And as long as the feed that you're giving those salmon is something clean like the microalgae and insect protein, you have a really clean fertilizer that helps kickstart that whole ecosystem that ends up also creating a fish attracting device for so many other wild species in the environment. So these sorts of practices of aquaculture, these types of aquaculture that I named, extensive farming, integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. Another example is recirculating aquaculture or RAS systems. Recirculating aquaculture systems are generally land-based systems that recycle 100% of the water. So it's a closed loop cycle. No water is, all the water is being reused, all the water is being filtered, and it's a lot more expensive to maintain a system like that. But in theory, this is an example of a zero impact on the environment model of aquaculture. And again, as long as you have good feed inputs, you can create really healthy sources of seafood, and you can place these sort of farms very close to the market. So recirculating aquaculture, shrimp farms exist in cities on top of buildings. We work with a research and aquaculture steelhead trout farm in upstate New York that serves that community, and there's there's some really great potential to see RAS systems supporting inland communities, especially when they're paired with access to abundant energy like rivers, hydroelectric, and things of that nature. So, yeah, three examples of types of aquaculture that we support, which are very, very different from intensive commodity farms that are feeding them corn and soy, which results in fish that are have a bunch of inflammation in their gut and are more susceptible to disease and end up needing antibiotics. You give fish a healthy diet to begin with, and they don't need antibiotics. So, huge differences just starting with like this type of farming, and then more nuance. What are they eating, and ensuring that they have the species appropriate diet that's rich in omega-3s and not omega-6s.
Gotcha. So are you sourcing some of your seafood that you're distributing from various farms?
Yeah,
Is that what
we're
I'm
working
gathering?
with about a
Okay.
dozen farms at the moment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep. Yep. We're working with a scallop farm in Peru that is raising these beautiful sushi grade scallops in these hanging lantern baskets. They're just filtering the water. They're not fed anything. It's an example of extensive farming. They're literally just converting phytoplankton, zooplankton into protein and growing these beautiful sushi grade scallops while filtering and cleaning the water. We're working with salmon farms in New Zealand and steelhead trout in Chile, as I mentioned, and upstate New York, and branzino and sea bream in Spain and Kampachi in Hawaii. Yeah, all around the world. We've basically decided that Seatopia needs to exist in order to create more education and demand for specific types of farms and specific farms that are worth celebrating, farms that are doing things right, that are producing some of the best fish in the world. And we don't sell any wild caught seafood, not because I don't believe like good wild caught seafood exists, but it is harder to come by. More importantly, wild caught seafood already has enough demand. We don't need another website, another retailer selling more wild caught seafood. What we need is more education and demand for the best practices, developing the best aquaculture. And that's why Seatopia exists.
I see. Okay. So you basically you kind of select these farms based on their qualifications, based on the quality of their output, and based on their inputs, I would assume,
Yeah.
for the fish.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Inputs are super important. And then it's worth noting that we not only are looking at what these fish are being fed, and shellfish and shrimp and all these other species, not only what are they being fed, but we test every single lot that we receive with third-party laboratories that quantify to the parts per billion the presence of heavy metals, the presence of microplastics, and also what's to ensure what we don't want in it, things that are potentially toxic that have bioaccumulated through the environment, but also quantifying what's in it, like the omega-3, the levels of selenium, the levels of vitamin D, to provide more concrete evidence for what is good seafood, what is great seafood, so that as consumers, we can vote with our dollars for the best seafood available. Like, to me, it's less important, like, what is the price per pound, but what is like the price per milligram of bioavailable DHA. Like, I want to eat the healthiest food I can possibly get. And for me, it just so happens that seafood works great for my body type. Like, I love seafood. I feel the most vital and alert and clear headed and focused when I'm eating clean seafood, especially raw seafood. It just works for my body type. And I want to eat seafood as often as I can from the cleanest sources that have the highest levels of the nutrients, the micronutrients in the most bioavailable format. And that's what we're trying to do with Seatopia is help foster the superfoods of seafood. I believe that seafood was the original super nutrient, and evolutionarily we developed and evolved eating seafood. But because of environmental pollutants and other issues with overfishing, getting access to really clean, nutrient-rich seafood is not as easy as it used to be.
Right, the pollution is in this in the ocean and so forth. So you're able to kind of bridge the gap, I guess, between farm raised and wild caught. And it sounds like you've taken the best of both while trying to eliminate the risks of either one. From
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely. I
from the
mean,
heavy metals on one side to the inputs on the other
yeah,
in the
yeah.
environment.
Jacques Cousteau famously said the transition from hunters and gatherers to farmers was the mark of civilization, and that we need to learn to do the same thing in the ocean to transition from extractive to regenerative practices is really the mission of Seatopia. The nuance is not all farms are created equal. You know, I don't think Jacques Cousteau at the time realized that farming in the ocean would just be funded by big ag companies. And that's unfortunately what happened. A lot of the big first farms took money from or were funded by the same people that run the big industrial food systems.
Mm.
We also have great examples of small farms and scaling farms that are doing things right, that need to be celebrated, that are producing healthy seafood. And that's you know where the rubber meets the road is how do you source from the best farms, and how do we change our relationship with the ocean on this blue planet to be able to eat and produce this abundant supply of seafood in a way that's scalable and has a, if not a minimal, if not, positive impact on the environment. And with these extensive farms and the regenerative impact that we're having with things like our kelp planting project, I think it's not only doable, but evidently, we're doing it right now.
So you're actually adding kelp to the ocean. Then?
With every single order, it's so our mission with Seatopia is to have a net positive impact on the environment, to create a truly regenerative seafood supply chain. So one of the things that we do is plant kelp with every single order. So last season, we planted 10,000 kelp trees, essentially creating our own kelp forest up in British Columbia, which is the first of many that we want to create. And I think it's not the most popular thing to be doing. Yeah, there's a lot more high profile things we could be doing instead of playing underwater with seaweed. But
Mm.
kelp has an incredible impact on the environment. Not only is it, helping sequester carbon, but it has a massive ecosystem service of creating habitat for wild fish. Myriad species actually are spawning and leaving their eggs or seeking refuge in kelp forests. And we had a huge die-off of kelp forests in the northern Pacific in the last 10 years because of global warming, heating waters to the point where kelp just weren't sustaining. So we're helping support kelp reforestation projects with every order that Seatopia does that ships. So yeah, kelp reforestation is it's an important aspect of what we're doing.
I see. That's amazing. So the way they're farming these fish, in obviously in many times you said in an ocean environment. So we think of a big ocean. If there's mercury in one part of the ocean, we think there's mercury everywhere. So they're able to create water environments in which there's less or undetectable levels of heavy metals and plastics and so forth.
Great question. No, the unfortunately there's no walls in the ocean. You can create filters, and there's a lot of great filter feeders and deposit feeders that help do that, like kelp walls and 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 oyster banks and things of that nature. But the presence of heavy metals like mercury and microplastics in seafood generally gets into it through the feed. So if you're
Oh,
feeding these fish, if you're feeding the fish, not all the farms we work with are feeding, but if you're feeding, it's about changing what they're eating. So how do fish get mercury and microplastics inside them in the flesh? They get it through bioaccumulation, and they get it because somewhere further down the trophic levels, at the level of phytoplankton, a mercury or microplastics was attracted to this organism, and then it bound to that organism that was then consumed by something like a zooplankton or a phytoplankton, and then that was consumed, but let's just say 2 or 3 of those were consumed by a sardine, and then 5 sardines were consumed by a mackerel, and then 20 mackerel were consumed by a salmon, and then 1,000 salmon were consumed by a killer whale. That's the reason why, as you go up the trophic level, you see bioaccumulation or biomagnification. The presence and quantity of mercury and microplastics bioaccumulates as you go up the food chain. So in seafood, if you want to eat a low mercury diet, there's something called a SMASH diet. If you're going to eat wild seafood, look for species in the SMASH acronym, which is like salmon, herring, mackerel, and I don't know, I misspelled already, but
Sardines, I think.
sardines. Yeah. So when you stay lower on the trophic level, there's less bioaccumulation. In aquaculture, we instead of feeding them a large quantity of fish that have been bioaccumulating mercury, we feed them something at the very bottom of the trophic level that hasn't ever been exposed to that. And you do that by removing fish oil and fish meal from the diet. So most aquaculture uses fish oil or fish meal, which is ground up sardines, anchovies, things of that nature, the bait fish. And then those are turned into fish oil and fish meal. And that is a huge component of commodity seafood diets. Well, Aquaculture 3.0, like the most innovative farms that we're working with today, have replaced the use of that with things like microalgae oil and insect protein that did not have exposures to those same environmental pollutants because they were grown in specific environments. The soldier flies that are allowed to be used in aquaculture come from pre-consumer organic waste, and the microalgae are grown in industrial scale farming operations that are fertilizing or that are fermenting these microalgae. So Schizocrytia in particular is the species of microalgae that NASA found and identified as having the most potential to grow healthy DHA for astronauts in space and or voyages beyond. And it's now being used today as the most efficient form of producing DHA, EPA rich microalgae for aquaculture.
I see. Okay. Wow. Comes from the food, comes from what they eat. That's surprised. That's what happens to us, right? In many cases, we pick up our toxins from our food.
Yeah.
So that's the fish do the same. Amazing. So have you had much, is there much political or government support for this type of operation? I mean, I know we've got regenerative ag is beginning to get some attention on a political level, government level, to get some funding driven that way for what you're trying to do. I realize you're pulling sources from multiple countries, and so that would be that decision would vary. But at least in the United States, is there much support?
It depends on how old the people are that you're asking.
Gotcha.
We have a really cool warehouse in Southern California in San Pedro, and we get every week there's like a different high school program or local university or nonprofit that comes and visits, and it's amazing. Sometimes it's even younger, like elementary schools. It's always refreshing to know that the next generation of voters is much more savvy about aquaculture and has a different appreciation for the importance of aquaculture. And that is sort of a reflection of the times, because when you and I grew up, the only aquaculture, large-scale aquaculture projects in like Washington State were doing like really terrible factory farming practices, open net pens that had a lot of, escapes. They were using an invasive, a non-native species that was escaping. They were feeding them corn and soy and antibiotics and hormones, not examples of the types of aquaculture that we are supporting. And it really swayed sort of consumer awareness and social license for, the desire for any aquaculture to expand into, further in the United States. So open ocean, open net pen aquaculture in the United States is almost non-existent. There's really only one farm doing open net pen aquaculture in the United States, and that's in Hawaii. And they're doing an amazing job. It's a farm that we work with called Blue Ocean Mariculture, raising kampachi. And I have a deep relationship with the kampachi. I worked with a kampachi farm in the Sea of Cortez for a number of years. It's one of the superstars of aquaculture. So not all species of aquaculture, not all species of fish should be farmed, in my opinion. Just like on land, you don't see us going out and farming cheetah or lions, because it's just not the most efficient use of land and or feed and energy. Like, they consume tuna, for example, are being farmed in a few exceptions because people want it, but not because I believe it's a truly scalable or sustainable business model. It requires 20 pounds of feed to get the animal to grow 1 pound. Whereas you look at something like kampachi, they are less picky about what they eat, so you can very easily get them to eat on a microalgae based diet, and they convert feed very efficiently, like up to 1-to-1 input to growth. That is a great species to be growing. It is being grown in Hawaii. It's a native species there. It was a native species where we're doing it in Mexico as well. They're doing it in deep water at low density, and so clean inputs, clean water, clean fish. And it also has become a fish attracting device in an area where previously there wasn't much activity. Now local fishermen use that as a site to go fishing, because you have this environment that tracks and creates structure for other small organisms that attracts larger organisms. So it has a positive impact on not only the environment but on the community. That is a great example. I hope that we see more of that, but it's going to take time because the governments in California and Maine and other states have been very leery of aquaculture. The exception is on land. We have a lot of aquaculture being developed on land in the United States, land-based recirculating aquaculture systems that we talked about earlier. It's been a lot easier to get those permitted because there's zero environmental impact other than the use of water and or electricity, and they can help offset the huge deficit that the United States has on the import of seafood. Like, the biggest driver for political change in the United States is probably going to come through the lens of the trade deficit that the U.S. has on seafood. We import billions of dollars worth of seafood every year, as opposed to being able to produce it locally. So from a food security and sovereignty perspective, there is support from some people in the political sphere, but the environmental backlash from commodity farms in the 80s and 90s has left a bad taste in most of the public perception of aquaculture. Thus, we source our products mainly from either land-based farms in the United States, with the exception of the Hawaiian kampachi, or internationally. But in places like Mexico, for example, there's a robust permitting and environmental impact study and governmental support for aquaculture, because they already went through the challenges of overfishing their local waters and finding that communities previously, that were supported by fisheries, turning to government subsidies was not a sustainable way to support their communities. So they've invested in helping train and educate a lot of these communities to actually develop sustainable incomes and sustainable industries and high-tech jobs in aquaculture. And I think eventually we'll see more of this in the United States as we continue to mine the resources that we have in the ocean of seafood. Gotcha. Cod, in the Cape Cod, America's first gold rush was a huge industry that we thought was infinite, and it collapsed. And the sardines in Monterey is another example of that. And tuna in Southern California, we had huge tuna canneries and whatnot here in Southern California. All of these industries have gone Alaska is trying to be sustainable, but every year you see these lawsuits between indigenous folks and different fractions fighting over finite resources. I'm not super bullish on human ability to self-govern greed of mining natural resources, and I think eventually we will see a lot more aquaculture as a necessary part of sustaining local communities.
I see. So the
Yeah,
aquaculture can actually produce more fish in less space. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
100%.
Or okay,
Absolutely. I mean, think about a fish in nature. It's going to release, let's just say, like 100,000 or a million eggs. And those eggs in the wild, 1% might make it to maturity. In an aquaculture, in a hatchery environment, you can get upwards of a 90% survival rate. So you have just way more fish being raised to maturity. The
okay,
problem, and this is interesting, exactly that is what created the sort of the unsustainable model of aquaculture, is because in the 1970s and 80s, when Atlantic salmon farms started, uh, some of the first commercial scale salmon farms in the world started in the 70s and 80s. So it's not a very long industry, but
right.
when they started getting these survival rates and raising millions of species of salmon instead of predators eating them, all of a sudden in the water you have just a huge biomass of salmon that need to be fed, and they were all extracting from the wild fish were eating the bait fish, and now you have this huge biomass of farm fish eating ground up bait fish, and there was so much pressure put on bait fish that the UN was like, and other governmental bodies recognize that it's not a scalable business model to continue to feed aquaculture raised fish on that same diet. So we've seen a push away from an evolution away from feeding aquaculture bait fish initially, and what most of the industry is doing today. The transition went to commodity subsidized corn and soy because that is the most abundant form of fats and proteins on the planet. We all know that doesn't produce more quality, that just produces more quantity. There's been
Right.
this there's been this semi misguided principle that has driven a lot of decisions, that is, we need to produce more food cheaply.
Right.
And I have a little bit different approach. I think we need to produce better food and healthier food, more bioavailable food, and that's I think where Seatopia is trying to differentiate, is which farms around the world are not only doing it sustainably but doing it better, producing healthier fish, not using the bait fish, but not using corn and soy either, actually using microalgae and insect protein or other species appropriate protein diets in order to produce fish that are healthier for human consumption and for the environment and their local communities.
So like an insect meal, or like just dropping crickets
Absolutely.
everywhere.
No, absolutely.
Okay.
Insect meals
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crickets and black soldier flies, and there's a couple other species that are being scaled that are very efficient. Um, Still relatively expensive, but economies of scale are changing all those things every year.
Sure.
And
But of
and
course
if you
there's no farm bill to support the growth of microalgae and crickets and so forth for you guys, like there is for corn and soy.
yeah, that
So
corn
yeah,
and
that
soy
would affect.
has a really direct connection to subsidies, and we haven't quite
Yeah.
unlocked or redirected that. But yeah, it'll happen eventually. We
Okay.
need people to actually appreciate life and want to eat healthier, and if people just keep going to the store and asking for the cheapest food as opposed to the most nutrient dense food, they're always going to just ask what's the price per pound. But if they ask what is the price per milligram of nutrients like DHA and EPA or selenium or protein, they're going to make different choices. And so that's what we're trying to do with Seatopia, is make it super prevalent with these lab tests, what is in the fish and what's not in the fish, and empowering consumers to make decisions based on the actual bioavailable nutrient density that's in the foods that we eat.
Gotcha. Very good. So it sounds like there really is a win-win for the environment as well as the farmer. I mean, in that, or the farmer, or the person raising the seafood, because
Yep.
I would think so in my mind, not knowing your industry, there's a lot of ecological public money out there. So if you can show that benefit to the environment by, like you said, 10,000 kelp trees, or
Hmm.
you see you go in like the people in Spain or Portugal, maybe you mentioned, where
Yep.
they're flooding the salt area, and then you see life come back, like we
Oh
see in
yeah.
regenerative ag areas in Texas and Africa, and all actually all over the U.S., where we see
Yep.
birds and bees and grass is growing that weren't there, right? They weren't
Yes.
there, and they're coming back. So if you guys are doing that in the ocean, is that not attractive to some sort of environmental program that would benefit everyone? Where you have some.
Increasingly. Yeah, it's happening. It's happening.
Okay.
We're seeing increasing, but it's a slow ship to turn. Absolutely.
Okay.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's amazing before and after photos of these estuaries, for example, just being, complete dead zones, just salt flats, and turned into just lush habitat where you have flamingos and osprey and a myriad of bird life and other species of fish that are coming into these environments. Estuaries are critically important parts of the ecosystem. These marsh wetlands that often just get bulldozed and turned into, uh, you know, developments.
Right.
These are the breeding ground for so many species like halibut that are known as ocean going, ocean fish. They spawn and breed in these estuaries. There's a lot of species that come up into estuaries in order to seek refuge during this period of their life cycle. And when we destroy and take away these environments, where this is directly related to why the ocean is less abundant than it used to be. So we're learning.
Yeah, no, I think what you're doing is amazing. I mean, it has a positive impact all the way around. And like you said, you have to educate the public, which I think is always the case with something new like this. They just don't understand
Yeah.
the difference, the benefit to them, but the benefit to the environment and then to the economy as well, because you're able to, as you said, as you create economies of scale and these get more efficient, you have growth, you have more supply that is more efficient than fishing the ocean directly traditionally,
Yes.
and with less downside, with less risk to the environment, and a greater input to the fish population. So you said there's only a few open net
In the United
estuaries
States. Yeah.
in the United States, but in other countries is that more common?
Yeah. Yeah. In other countries, aquaculture has had a lot more adoption.
And so they just stay close because that's where the food is and that's where the environment is that they like. They're not. They're
There's still
swimming
there's
off to find new homes. Or,
in the estuary environments, there are still controls. There's canals with gates that allow water to come in at high tide, and then they stop it. And so generally, what they do is the water will come in at high tide and come to the highest pond, and then as the tide goes out, they will redirect a portion of that water to the lower ponds. So there's always water flowing through the different ponds and canals. So you have this regular flushing of inbound water from the tides, and then they slowly allow it to go through the rest of the pond. So the natural species are being allowed to come in, but then they still have controls at different gateways in order to prevent large fish from going back out to the ocean that they don't want. So there's absolutely an exchange, and there are also great examples of farms that use open net pens and also rehabilitate local waters by releasing fish. So, for example, there's a farm in the Sea of Cortez raising a species of croaker called totuaba that's highly endangered. These totuaba are really delicious, but you can't export them to the United States, for example, because we've listed them as endangered. So you can't import endangered species, even though they're raised from eggs. But one of the cool things this farm does is their hatchery, as with many hatcheries, can very efficiently breed, spawn, and raise fingerlings. But they only have so much demand for their fish, so they're not going to put 100% of the fish back into the pens and raise them all to maturity and have to feed them all if they don't actually have a market. So they actually release fish every year, and they're helping to rebuild the local population. And in Southern California, there's release programs for white sea bass. In Northern California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, there's rehabilitation programs for salmon. I think something like 60 or more percent of the salmon that are caught by fishermen are actually born and released from hatcheries. So yeah, we're more dependent on hatcheries and wild release of salmon in North America than people realize.
Wow. Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I had no idea. Wow.
Yeah.
So we're kind of maybe offsetting the kind of the overfishing situation,
Yeah. Trying to maintain it. Mm-hmm.
trying to maintain while still improving the environment. So, wow, that's quite an undertaking. You think there'd be a lot more support for it, but I guess, like you said, it's new, and there needs to be more education, as we just saw. And if you were paying attention to the health, there's some MDs, but then just some health influencers, health coaches, health writers that were just at the Senate earlier this week, talking about processed food and corn and monocrops and so forth. And it's probably the first time it's ever happened where we've had that many health practitioners speaking to Senate about what's happening to our food system and pointing out processed food and the impact on our bodies and children, and how it's changed our health and what we need to do about it, and or at least address it.
Yes.
But it got no mainstream press, and some of it was very negative because it was made into a political thing. Rather than listening to the actual message, it was twisted as a political talking point. Rather than these are people who have been trying to influence people's health for 5, 10 plus years, and are well established in the public, or at least in the alt health scene. And it's there's a grassroots of people listening to it and watching them on YouTube and so forth. But I'm sure many of the congressmen who are listening have no personal point of reference for what they're talking about.
No, not if they're
many of the people covering
policies.
and many people covering it didn't understand it, because especially if they're younger, they haven't seen the change that you and I have seen in our public health, in the way kids used to look versus how kids look now, and the infiltration of our food system by what's happening with industrial farming and what's happening in industrial farm raising of fish.
Absolutely.
It's not the same food. It may look like the same fish, but inside it's not the same fish.
It's cornflakes.
Yeah, exactly. It's like cornflakes. And so it's new conversations. There's an education of the public, which then starts redirecting dollars, and then government seems to slowly pay attention or slowly move. But I think it will come to people voting with their dollars.
100%.
Like that. Yeah.
100%. I do not. Seatopia exists because we're not waiting for government handouts in order to help support aquaculture. Seatopia exists because we, as a community, want to eat healthier food, and we're voting with our dollars to support artisan farms. And some of these farms are so small that it literally is a lifeline to have a sales channel of consumers that want to pay for this fish. Like, I've had farmers tell us this is the only channel that is willing to pay what it costs to produce fish the way that we actually want to produce fish. Because it's worth noting, no marine biologist gets into this industry saying, hey, I want to produce commodity fish that is cheap and feed it soy and corn. Every marine biologist that gets into this field gets into it because they're passionate about the ocean. They're avid scuba divers that just love and are fascinated and want to learn from nature. And yet they realize that the industry doesn't support them, that it's just the commoditization of our food system is a race to the bottom, and is just trying to produce like more crap, more corn-fed cornflakes, So another interesting anecdote is that when we first launched Seatopia, our homepage and our messaging was, this is the most sustainable, eco-friendly, innovative aquaculture product in the world. And we thought that sort of the eco-friendly, ocean-loving, scuba dive community marine biologists would support Seatopia. And they did. And they said, bravo, Seatopia, this is really cool. But our sales did not hockey stick. It didn't really hockey stick until we started publicly sharing the results of the lab testing that we were doing. And when we started sharing the health benefits and the cleanliness and comparing apples to apples, what fish, how the nutritional content responds to various diets, all of a sudden the health conscious community responded. And so we're not waiting around for environmental policy to support what we're doing. We're taking the vote with your dollars approach. And there's a very different audience that is willing to pay for healthier food than the audience that just says that would maybe support from an environmental standpoint. It's not one or the other. And that's the interesting thing, is that you actually can't produce the healthiest food in the world without also having the healthiest environment. The healthiest foods come from the healthiest environment. Yes. And the best farms that we work with come from have the best environmental practices. And that is the same on land as it is in the ocean. So you can't have human health without environmental health. You can't have human health without ocean health. They are intricately aligned and connected. And by empowering this community of people who value their own lives and really want to live to be healthy and vibrant at 115, they're choosing Seatopia because they want that DHA that was associated with blue zone diets. And they understand the importance of having a source of DHA that's not full of microplastics and mercury, so that they can have the cognitive function. And they're feeding it to their kids and their unborn children and pregnant wives. Right. You know, my wife, while pregnant, through 2 pregnancies, ate sushi grade seafood every single day, especially in her 3rd trimester. She was intolerant to a lot of other fish, and meats and proteins, but the one thing she could digest readily and felt good was eating sushi grade seafood. And you can really only do that when you know what it was fed, you know how it was handled, you know how it was processed, and you have the certificate of analysis to see what's in it. This empowers moms and biohackers and longevity focused foodies to live healthier, happier lives. And that's what we're trying to do with Seatopia is make food medicine, in particular seafood, and return the potential of seafood, back to people that.
Absolutely. So you have those certificates of analysis, those analysis of your food comparisons on your website then?
Publicly available on every product detail page.
Oh, product detail page. Okay.
Yeah, you go to the product detail page and you can see the certificate of analysis, the lab test. You can see to the parts per billion, the levels of mercury on every lot. You can see the mercury analysis. This information is necessary for us to not only make consumers aware, but also to hold farms accountable and to hold the feed mills accountable and to help drive change. And it is very unique to do this as a retailer, as a seafood producer, as a farmer. But this is how we're going to change the supply chain. This is how we change our relationship to seafood, is focusing on transparently producing and supporting with our dollars the very best products.
That's awesome. And something I noticed as well on your site and when I was kind of looking into your business is there is a real focus on the supply chain. Like you mentioned, how you're essentially creating a supply chain through, you're sourcing through various sources, but to get it to, I guess you're shipping through all over the United States. Is that generally?
Yeah, we ship to homes all over the United States, and we didn't launch the business until we felt like we could do it in an authentically sustainable way. So there's no styrofoam in our supply chain. Our whole shipping is carbon offset, carbon neutral. We are prioritizing ocean freight, frozen product. We don't ship fresh product because fresh product requires airplanes and styrofoam. So we're trying to build an entire supply chain that authentically can scale distribution of seafood in a sustainable and specifically a regenerative manner.
Wow.
Yeah, when we first launched, we had zero plastic as well. We now are using some plastic. The pouches that we put our shrimp and our scallops in are a bio-based plastic that is. But when we launched, all of our plastics were bio-based and recyclable or biodegradable, and we had some challenges with the integrity of those products, and we switched back to some just recyclable products. But this is an area of R&D that we are going to solve, and we will get back to a zero plastic policy as soon as we possibly can. It is important from a mission perspective to be authentic in how we're doing it. And I think it's just greenwashing to call something like a sustainable seafood if you're putting it in styrofoam and shipping around the world on airplanes and feeding it corn and soy. And it's just like, that's not really sustainable. Like, what, because you have like a green logo or an electric boat, it's just not enough. Like, the whole thing needs to be like the whole relationship. In Japan, there's a word called that I believe it's pronounced itatakemasu, and it was described to me as a saying that's commonly used like right before eating. It's kind of like a thank you, but traditionally it was a gratitude and acknowledgement for every cog in the supply chain all the way back to the sun. So think about this, like when you eat food, you're supposed to acknowledge like who brought this to you, who cut it, who washed it, who caught it, thank the fish, thank the microalgae, thank the sunlight that was converted through photosynthesis into that. And that is your like greeting. And when you start thinking about all the layers, you have to just be like, this is not, this, you can't do this sustainably if your whole supply chain is dependent on styrofoam. That's just
Right.
silly.
Well, I think
So
that thankfulness for food has your source of food, and when you're acknowledging where it came from and how it got to you in that purity, in that pure setting that you just, or pure channel that you just described, we've lost the sense of food being scarce, because
mm,
food is no longer scarce. But that acknowledges the scarcity of good, wholesome food, because food has become abundant and convenient and for comfort and on every corner. Like I said, and it's just there, right? It's everywhere. We can get what we want when we want, delivered to our door. We've lost that. We're not going to be as thankful for something that isn't scarce,
mm,
or that we're not recognizing or acknowledging the wholesomeness of, like the benefits to our bodies. Or no one's thanking for a Twinkie, right? No
mm.
one's thanking for their French fries,
Soda.
right?
Yeah.
And soda, and
Yeah.
their fast food things come in a little box. That
Yeah.
no one. I mean, maybe some people do, but if they were really to think about where that food came from, and
Yeah.
blessing it to their
Yeah. Yeah.
body,
Thank you for
uh,
these food colorings and these chemicals I can't pronounce. Yeah.
who's
No.
yeah,
Yeah.
their breakfast cereal? No, probably not. If you really want to, if you're really thinking about what you're doing, that's not going to nourish you. I don't care what you say over it.
Mm-mm.
And so when you said that, it made me think about like what we find in the regenerative ag, on the land regenerative ag, with cattle and sheep and pork and so forth, where it's scarce. There's a reason that it's hard work, right? And it's scarce. And when they acknowledge that these animals, they take care of those animals, these ranchers do, as your ranchers take care of their fish. But it's a there's thoughtfulness into the inputs that's going into these livestock,
Yes.
whether land or sea, because you want to create a wholesome product, not a commodity that you're trying to just scale and price. But it's a
Right.
wholesome product, and so you have individual. I think with the difference with the ranchers as well, from an industrial flywheel, where we
Mm-hmm.
have like in meat we have four multinational corporations that are controlling all of them. 85% of the meat in the
Right.
U.S.
Yeah.
And their supply chain is what it's all about. Their supply chain. They're buying it cheap. They're mass producing. They're buying it from all over the world, shipping it in, shipping out the U.S. beef to the Pacific Rim. Many people don't realize that. The best beef goes outside the U.S. and we bring in lower quality beef, and sell it in a commoditized fashion with little regard for the care of the animal, all the things they have to give to the animal to keep it from getting sick. I believe that's true with many of the industrial fish
Absolutely.
aquacultures, where they
Same
have to
business
give
model.
them because they get too packed in, so they
Yeah.
have
And they don't
parasites
have a
and
strong immune system because the diet is crap and they're inflamed because they're just being fed GMO corn, inflammation in the gut. Like, yeah, same
and the
exact
parasites
business
that come from
model.
being packed into a small space, like much like a CAFO system. You have a don't you have similar systems with fish where it's like the
Absolutely.
packed in
The
natures, you have
density.
parasites and
Yeah. Yeah.
virus or whatever is that
Yeah. A parasite, a disease would just go through an entire population if that, because that density is much higher. Yeah, absolutely. Low density farming is less is not as cost effective, but you get a return on investment in quality. And if people are just producing for price and trying to produce the cheapest product, whether that's meat or fish, you're going to have a cheap commodity product. You know, we have to think about quality over quantity. You know, we, I don't think we have a shortage of protein in the United States or in the world. I think that there's lots of proteins and things being produced. It's just the quality. You know, there's so much crap being produced. We don't need more crap. We need higher quality. There's some statistics showing like the life expectancy of the average US male is getting shorter in the United
oh yeah
States,
yeah
and it directly correlates to food. Like this should be an alarm that is that waking up people to change what they're doing, because we are what we eat. And
yes
as a society, we're dying earlier because we are eating crap. But there are absolutely better options out there.
yeah
It just requires people actually caring enough to ask. And it's the exact same questions that need to be asked in seafood. It's not that complicated. Where was this farmed? Who farmed it? And what did it eat? If you ask those questions, you'll get really interesting answers. And if the people that are selling it to you don't have those answers, probably should buy it from somebody else.
Well, I mean, that's the case with ranchers and their brand, and they lose that brand when they sell into the industrial system. But you have no idea when they go to the industrial system, you have no idea what the inputs are, you have no idea where it came from. But if you buy directly from a rancher, they know
Yeah.
exactly what into their beef, they know where it was, what if it had any medicines, what medicines went in.
Yeah.
And so it's I guess same with fish. They know when you have like what you're saying, someone who is taking care of this fish is doing it the right way, they can tell you where it came from and what, like you just said, what went into those fish, what were the inputs, what did they go through,
Yeah.
and you've got certificate of analysis of the contaminants and the nutrients. That's incredible. So the question that is posed to regenerative ag for land animals, I'm gonna ask you, is this scalable enough with these practices over time? Is it scalable enough to really feed, let's just say, feed the U.S. fish?
Mhm.
I mean, could
100%.
it handle the demand of the U.S. These kind of practices? Is there a way to scale these practices enough to replace the current supply or demand? Excuse me, this current demand of fish in the U.S.
Without question.
Okay.
This is the blue planet. And when the oceans are thriving, they create such abundance. I mean, there are historical records of bays being unnavigable because there were so many whales and dolphins and fish. Like the ocean can create abundance. You just need to give it a reprieve. We need to mitigate pressure on wild stock. We need to raise fish in a more sustainable, regenerative way, and we need to create a healthy relationship and with seafood. But the ability for the ocean to produce seafood is really mind-boggling, because you think about it, the majority of the ocean of the world, this planet is covered by water, and it's just surface area alone, that's more than 70%. But the fun thing about farming in the ocean is it's not one dimensional. You can farm three dimensionally. You farm deep in the ocean. You can farm 100 feet down, and you can create these three-dimensional farms that produce such abundance, and the symbiotic relationships between the fish pooping and the shellfish filter feeding and the uh, micronutrients being absorbed by kelp and the deposit feeders down below, like the lobster and the urchin, the uni, they all work symbiotically together. And when you create these environments, the potential and of clean protein being produced from this is what the planet evolved to do. And when humans are gone, it'll probably do it all over again. But if we get it right, yeah, we could probably produce a create a healthy relationship. And there's been some studies that show less than 5% of the coastline would be necessary to produce an abundance of seafood or protein for the entire population. So the
Wow.
amount of food that can be produced is through these models is mind-boggling. We just need a social license, b demand to do things right, and some time.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, you obviously are very passionate about the ocean. You have a lot of knowledge about the ocean and life and so forth. So, how did you come by this? I mean, what is your background with the ocean here?
Um, I definitely have a deep passion for the ocean. I spent over 10 years living on a sailboat. I've sailed from San Francisco to Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands and everywhere in between. I have a deep desire to change the relationship to seafood. I have a deep desire to share some of the things that I've seen with my children, and I have a deep desire to help show them that create things that are better, tomorrow than they are today. Like these kelp forests that we're building. My vision is to one day bring my children to a kelp forest that is just thriving with biodiversity and swim with them in there and show them like this is something that we created. Every time I left and you were crying and I said I have to go do something that's important, but I'm gonna make you proud. This is what we did. Like I want to create this like the I want to share and see like a true Seatopia on this blue planet. But I've been I've been brainwashed into this way of life since very young age. My father was a lifeguard. My earliest memories are fishing in the Sea of Cortez and traveling Baja. And my mom worked at SeaWorld, and I had like backstage access to meet like the Shamu trainers and got to uh, see and touch and be inspired by the ocean for many years as a youth. And it brainwashed me into dragging my wife onto a boat and sailing all around. And
Amazing.
yeah, and here
Yeah.
we are.
Wow. That's awesome. That's quite a. I can see it now. I get it. I get it. That's
Mhm.
incredible. Well, that's fantastic. Well, James, thank you so much for sharing that because I had no idea what you. I mean, personally, what you just most of what you just shared, how all that worked, and so I hope to more people, through this interview, will get to have a better understanding. Like you said, we've got to educate the public so they know where to send their dollars to support the things that they already believe in, but they don't realize are waiting for them, right? Are existing. And so I think that's what you have here is a really like an economy or ecology that is just waiting for enough people to know about it to help it grow
Yes.
because it benefits like I said, the full flywheel of the ecology of the ocean, our health,
Hmm.
and our economy, our
Yeah,
our, our, our country's economy as well.
absolutely.
It's so which those all work together, and you've got that all the and the direct opposition. You can see we know what's in direct opposition to it, and so the choices should be pretty clear.
Yeah.
But again, thank you for all that you've shared. Where can people find out more about Seatopia?
Seatopia.fish. You go to seatopia.com as well, but we like the dot fish.
That's
It's a
cool.
fun one. Yeah, I think on the social webs it's at Seatopia. But Seatopia.fish, you can vote with your fork and support really cool artisan farms that have stories that are worth telling and eat sushi grade seafood that is certified clean and healthy. Um, yeah, that's the best place to find us and be a part of this community that is having amazing shared experiences. It's so fun to bring people around the table and eat raw, beautiful sushi grade gourmet seafood. And, or, you can cook it if you want, and you don't have to cook it all the way through. You can leave it rare in the middle because you know that it's clean and healthy. And it just empowers people to feel like real badasses in the chefs in the kitchen when you have great quality. Um, that's the fun part. That's gathering around and actually experiencing it. And we're making that accessible through Seatopia.fish to customers nationwide in the U.S.
That's amazing. You supplying many restaurants? You just got to ask on a wholesale level. You guys get that
We
supply chain as
used
well.
to do that before COVID. What our whole business was focused on restaurants, but we've pivoted. I find that the telephone game is a lot shorter, just talking to people who care. Whereas, with the exception of a handful of restaurants, most restaurants require terms. They want 30-day payment terms. Then you have to ask them to pay you, and you have to sell the chef, and the chef then has to sell the server, and the server then sells the front of the house. And sometimes the CFO or accounting gets involved and says, "Hey, we could get the same product for $1 cheaper. Why are we supporting this sustainable aquaculture thing?" So
Gotcha.
with Seatopia focusing more on the health conscious community and focusing more on a group of people who are willing to pay per milligram of bioavailable DHA, as opposed to what is the price per pound of the cheapest salmon you can get. It's different. We're focused on an audience who have different goals, and I haven't found that in most restaurants. So there's a handful of restaurants that we sell to today, but mostly consumers who care, moms that are, recently pregnant and going through the process of cleaning out their homes, getting rid of toxic chemicals, and want to give their kids the best quality food they can, and fitness and biohackers who just want to live to be 120 and be quick and witty. That this is how you do it, is have clean DHA, in your synaptics and in your eyeballs and in your prefrontal cortex. These parts of our bodies that are like 60% DHA. Our bodies don't produce DHA. It
Right.
comes through food, and it's a critical nutrient that is most
For sure.
bioavailable from sushi grade seafood.
It's amazing. That's
Or you could
awesome.
just eat algae, but it's more enjoyable for me to have a beautiful plate of sushi.
Yeah, I'm not a big algae eater myself, but yeah, the sushi sounds fantastic. Awesome. Well, again, thanks again. I appreciate you sharing, I hope to connect if I'm out there in California again. But you guys are you're doing a great thing. You're a pioneer with this, and that's amazing. So I appreciate your time, and I'm really impressed by what you're doing. I'm just kind of a little bit in awe right now. So
Awesome.
that's awesome. All
Great.
right.
Thank you, Zane. Really a pleasure spending time with you. For you to care this much means a lot. Appreciate it.